we'll go through that bail hearing, we'll get bail set, or a guilty plea will be entered, something along those lines. Here in Nevada, prosecutors actually, unless they can find that there isn't a way that they could win the case, which happens, right? And this happens generally. Generally when a prosecutor says they can't win a case, it's because we have a domestic violence that occurs, police arrive, and the victim doesn't want to make a statement, or make a written statement. And so what happens when that occurs, in our Mesquite Police Department, and I'm sure Sergeant Chesley will talk about this, but they are some of the best I've seen, much better than Metro, and talking to these victims, talking to them on a level they can understand, connecting with them and getting them to write a written statement. And why that's so important is because if they don't get a written statement the night the domestic violence occurs, it's very likely that this cycle will start, and by the time the trial date rolls around, they won't want to testify. And if they don't want to testify at trial, and we don't have a statement from the night of the offense, then there's not much that we can do. Because they can get up and say, oh, I don't really remember what happened. Oh, it was my fault. I was being too pushy with him. I know he has his limits. I shouldn't do that. He didn't really hit me. It was a misunderstanding. The police misunderstood. But if we get them to write a statement the night of that says, he came home, he was, and I'm saying he, but domestic violence goes both ways. I know you all understand that as well. He came home and he shoved me up against the wall, and then he threatened me by saying these words. If they can write that down, then even if they don't want to testify down the road, we can still compel them to take the stand and say, we don't do it, hopefully we don't do it in a mean way, but you say, well, I understand now you're saying you don't remember, but isn't it true that on the night of the offense you said this? And we can actually use that statement under the rules of evidence. So that's why it's so important. And the reason I bring that up is so that you folks, when you're working with these victims, and as we hopefully will put together, get something going in that form, that you can know that's an issue, and that you can encourage victims to make statements to police when the police arrive, because those statements are just critical in prosecution. So back to the actual case now. Unless we have something like that, some deficiency of that nature, prosecutors are not allowed to dismiss or negotiate down a domestic violence. So we have to either work out a deal where they will have a domestic violence conviction, or we have to take it to trial and put on our best efforts. And the reason for that is that a domestic violence conviction has some serious consequences. Though it's not a felony, you're going to have problems like you can't own a, well, you're going to have problems with trying to obtain a gun, having a concealed weapons permit, which are good things, which the Nevada legislature has done. Now, and that's basically it. That's kind of the case from beginning to end. They show up, and then once sentence is imposed, hopefully on these offenders where it's deserving and just, they get that domestic violence conviction. Now briefly, I do want to talk on an issue that Karen's brought up, and that I think Marshall will talk a little bit to, and that's to something that's been going around Mesquite, and that's whether we should have a shelter here in town for these victims of domestic violence. What I want to say about that is the other communities I've served in, Las Vegas and Sacramento, have had multiple shelters for domestic violence victims. And I think all would agree that these are things that are great resources, because it helps in preventing the cycle of abuse from taking effect again. What I'd also note on it is they are almost always the brainchild of private nonprofit organizations, and that these private nonprofit organizations get together and they work in conjunction with police, with city officials, with courts, with other organizations in town in order to get used and in order to build themselves up so that we have a place for these victims to go. Now here in Mesquite specifically, and it's been asked me, do we need a full-blown shelter? I don't know. I don't know that we have the caseload that would necessitate that, but do we need something? Absolutely, we do, because we have a lot of folks here in town who are victims of domestic violence, and then they don't have anywhere to go besides back home to their apartment or back home to their house. And as soon as their significant other, or whoever their offender was, as soon as that person gets out of jail or bails out or something along those lines, they don't have anywhere else to go either, except back to the apartment or back home. And it is, incredibly sad to see how frequently, once they get back home together, things are okay and things work out well for them for about 6 or 7 months. And then we see them back in court again under the same circumstances, and it's going to get worse. And you try to explain that to them, and that's why I applaud what you guys, the League of Women Voters here in Mesquite, has put on today, because something needs to be done about that. Something needs to be done about these poor victims who have nowhere else to go and don't understand and are just going to keep putting themselves in this position over and over and over until something so horrible happens that they have no choice to be out of the situation.